Good morning and most welcome to 1202 of the Age series. We will today continue with Louder Than Words by Benjamin K. Bergen. And we are in the chapter Don't Think About an Elephant. Something that is very recognizable. We mentioned it loads of times before. And what it is about, it is almost impossible to disregard a thought once it's been put in your mind. And everybody who has ever had anything to do with children know that once you mention something, it will be stuck in their head, in their thinking. So don't go into the cupboard. It's not something recommendable to say to a 4-year-old toddler. A book came out a couple of years ago called Don't Think of an Elephant. It turns out not thinking about something is a pretty hard entry to comply with. Go ahead and try not to think of an elephant. Don't think of one. Really, try it. If you are like most people, you can't help but see a large, tusked pachyderm in your mind's eye. No matter how heroic our attempt, no matter how steely our resolve, we almost succumb to a mental image of the big-eared animal. It is as almost if you can't hear the name for something and not create a visual representation of it. At least that's what it seems like intuitively. But we should be wary of relying entirely on intuition. People have intuitions about all kinds of things that turn out to be wrong. Like your intuition about how a lock works. Whatever you think, it doesn't work that way. Or whether you're sober enough to drive, you probably aren't. What we want to see in empirical evidence confirming the intuition that merely mentioning an object evokes visual stimulation. Cognitive psychologist Rolf Zwahn conducted a series of elegant experiments to ask whether this is the case. He started with a simple observation that when objects are in different orientations, they look different. Consider a nail, for example. When it's being hammered into the floor, it's pointed downward, and that looks different from a nail being hammered into a wall. So Zwahn asked whether people automatically construct mental images of objects like nails in a specific spatial orientation when a sentence implies that they are in one orientation or the other. In their experiment, Zwahn and his students had people first read a sentence like, "The carpenter hammered the nail into the floor," or "The carpenter hammered the nail into the wall." Immediately after reading each sentence, a picture of an object, for instance a nail or an elephant, popped up on the screen. Their task was to decide as quickly as possible whether the depicted object had been mentioned in the preceding sentence. Sometimes the object had not been mentioned, but in all of the cases of interests, it had indeed been mentioned, the nail, so the correct answer was yes. The key manipulation was that when the picture had been mentioned, it could either match the implied orientation of the object or mismatch it. That is, after reading about a nail that was being hammered into the floor, a participant might see a matching subject. And conversely, after reading about the nail being hammered into the wall, they might see a matching picture of a nail pointing sideways or a mismatching picture of a nail pointing downwards. What Swan was expected was exactly what he found. People were faster to answer correctly when the orientation of the object implied by the sentence matched the orientation of the picture. Why should people be able to respond faster when the implied orientation of the object mentioned in the sentence is matched its orientation in the picture? A very reasonable explanation is that when people read sentences, they construct visually detailed simulations of the objects that are mentioned. Makes sense? In this case, the orientation of the object. They are able to respond faster because what they see and what they're mentally simulating are more similar. But when the visual details, like the orientation of their embodied simulation and the picture they see, are different, it takes longer to determine that they are the same object. There have now been a dozen or so studies that uses variants of this paradigm, confirming our original intuition that people construct visual simulations of objects they read or hear about. But how do the details get into our embodied simulations? How do we know to simulate the nail pointing down or horizontally? What's interesting is that there isn't necessarily anything explicit in the sentences that tells you. But when the visual details, like the orientation of their embodied simulation and the picture they see, are different, it takes longer to determine that they are the same object. There have now been a dozen or so studies that uses variants of this paradigm, confirming our original intuitions that people construct visual simulations of the objects they read or hear about. But how do the details get into our embodied simulations? How do we know to simulate the nail pointing down or horizontally? What's interesting is that there isn't necessarily anything explicit in the sentences that tells you. The orientation of the nail in the sentences above isn't determined by the word nail. That's held in constant between the sentences. But it is also not determined independently by the words floor or wall, or even the association between either of these words and nail. To prove this to yourself, think about what orientation that the nail has in. The carpenter hammered the nail into the floor, and the carpenter put the nail on the floor. In the first, the nail is most likely pointing downward, but in the second, it's most likely horizontal, or even if you're feeling malicious, it might be pointing upward. But the point is that embodied simulation you produce in responses to sentences like this is the product of a number of parts of the sentence. In this case, at least two nouns, nail and floor, a verb, hammered or put, and a preposition, into or on. You can only figure out which way the nail is pointing by generating a pretty rich model of what's being described. Using all these pieces of language and what you know about how you interact with nails, floors, and walls. In other words, the only way that you could know what direction a nail would be pointing in a given context is by assessing your expansive word knowledge about how different things mentioned in the sentence interact. How very true. And of course, the orientation of objects isn't the only visual detail that you mentally simulate when you read or hear sentences. When a sentence implies that an object has a particular shape, you mentally represent it having that shape. For instance, the ranger saw the eagle in the nest might imply an eagle with folded wings. By contrast, when we hear a sentence like, the ranger saw an eagle in the sky, there's good reason to believe that the eagle has outstretched wings, physics and all that. Zwan and his students performed another experiment in which they exchanged the manipulation of object orientation for a manipulation of object shape. Everything else was the same as in the nail experiment. Each sentence mentioned an object with an implied shape, and people had to read the sentence and decide whether an object had been mentioned in the sentence. At this time, just like in the orientation study, people were faster to press a button indicating that the picture had been mentioned in the preceding sentence when the implied shape of the object matched the shape of the image. In other words, when a sentence implies that an object has a particular shape. We construct a mental representation of the object with that implied shape, just as we represent the implied orientation of objects. The results from these two studies seem to imply that people processing sentences automatically construct perceptually detailed embodied simulations of the described objects. But before taking that to the bank, we need to consider a reasonable objection to this methodology. Imagine you're a participant in the experiment. You know that your task is to read sentences and then decide whether in a subsequently displayed picture depicts an object's mentioned in the sentence. Because you know this, you might consciously build mental images of the objects you read about. And this might well be quite different from what you normally do when using language in the real world. That is, the effect might be due to demands of the task that are different from the demands placed on you when normally using language. Zwan and his students addressed this possibility by conducting a follow-up experiment in which they used the same shape manipulating sentences in a slightly modified task. Instead of deciding whether a depicted object had been mentioned in the preceding sentence, participants simply named each object as they saw it. This meant that for the participants, there was no longer any obvious relation between the sentences and the pictures, and it wouldn't help them at all to construct detailed embodied simulations of the objects mentioned in the sentence to perform the task. Nonetheless, the results were the same. Participants were faster to name a picture when it matched the shape of the preceding sentence. This shows us that people mentally simulate the visual effects, the visual details of objects, even when the experimental task does not lead to them. It appears to be quite natural for people understanding language to produce embodied simulations of the things that they read or hear about. Orientation and shape aren't the only properties of objects that could potentially appear in our embodied simulations. We perceive objects in the real world in large part through their color. Are the embodied simulation we construct while understanding language in black and white, or are they in color? It seems like the answer should be obvious. When you can imagine a yellow trucker hat, you feel the subjective experience of yellowness that looks a lot like yellow as you would perceive it in the real world. But it turns out that color is actually a comparatively fickle visual property of both perceived and imagined objects. Children can't use color to identify objects until about a year of age. Much later, than they can use shape. And even once they acquire this ability as adults, people's memory for color is substantially less accurate than the memory for shape. And they have to pay closer attention to detect changes in the color of objects than in their shape or location. And yet, with all this going against it, color still seeps into our embodied simulations, at least briefly. One study looking at color used the same sentence picture matching method we've been talking about. People read sentences that imply particular colors for object. For instance, John looked at the steak on his plate implies a cooked and therefore appropriately brown steak, while John looked at the steak in the butcher's window implies an uncooked and therefore red steak. In the key trials, participants then saw a picture of the same object which could either match or mismatch the color implied by the sentence. That is, the steak could be red or brown. Once again, this method produced an interaction. Curiously, though, the result was slower reactions to matching color images in the previous studies. One explanation for why this effect appears in the opposite direction is that perhaps people processing sentences only mentally simulate color briefly and then suppress color to represent shape and orientation. This might lead to slower responses to a matching color when an image is subsequently presented. In parentheses, it's important to note that this reversed effect does not mean that people aren't simulating color. That's an inference you might be expected to draw if there were a null effect. If there were no difference in response time to the differently colored images, regardless of which sentence they follow. These complexities notwithstanding, this study indicates that when a sentence mentions an object, people mentally simulate the color of that object, if transiently. All these studies point to the same conclusion. Hearing or reading language about objects leads people to mentally simulate those objects. So to come back to the issue we started with, it's not your fault if you can't help seeing an elephant when told not to. It's just an automatic part of understanding language. The elephant in the room. The visual properties we've been looking at, like an object's orientation, shape and color, are all properties that the brain calculates in the what pathway. So you can't help in seeing an elephant when told not to. It's just an automatic part of understanding language. The elephant in the room. The visual properties we've been looking at, like an object's orientation, shape and color, are all properties that the brain calculates in the what pathway. But we oftentimes describe object as being located in particular places or moving in particular directions. If someone tells you that there is an elephant in the room, do you simulate not only what the elephant looks like, but also where it might be? The broader question here is whether people mentally simulate location and motion, features that are computed using the where pathway. Let's start with the simplest case. Objects tend to appear in specific locations. Grass is typically below your feet, and the ceiling is usually above your head. And as a result, you know when you hear words for such things where you should expect to find them. A puddle, a cloud, a manhole cover all have canonical locations. Down, up, down. So we might begin by asking, does language about objects like these engage the where pathway of your visual system? We ran a study in my lab that investigated this question based on the Bergen effect discussed in the last chapter. You will recall that in her work, Bergen found that people have a harder time perceiving objects when they are simultaneously visually simulating objects in the same location. In our study, we presented participants with simple recorded sentences like the sky darkened or the grass glistened. In all these sentences, the noun like sky or grass was an object with a canonical location, and the verb like darkened or glistened didn't imply anything about the location or the motion of the object. Very soon after hearing each sentence, the participants saw a shape on the computer screen, which was either a circle or a square. They had to decide whether they saw a circle or a square and push an appropriate button to indicate their choice. The shape itself also appeared for only a fifth of a second, which made the task quite difficult. Although the participants thought we were interested in circles and squares, we were really manipulating another feature of the shapes, which was where they appeared on the screen. For the sentence that we were interested in, the shapes always appeared either in the upper part of the screen or in the lower part of the screen, always horizontally centered. What we wanted to see was whether processing a sentence about an object that is canonically found in an up location, like sky or cloud, would affect how long it took people to perceive a shape appearing in the upper part of the screen, and vice versa for objects that canonically appear in the lower location, like grass or a puddle. What we found was surprising. It took an additional 30 milliseconds, and this is a lot. For people to categorize the circle or square when it appeared in the same location where a just mentioned object would canonically appear. You might think this sounds counterintuitive. Why would it take longer to say that an object was a circle or square when you saw it in the upper part of the screen after hearing a sentence describing an object in the upper part of the visual field? Shouldn't this be faster because the objects are in the same location? Actually, no. Recall that when people perform visual simulation, they use the same parts of the brain that are responsible for actual vision. When you mentally simulate objects that would normally appear above you, you use the parts of your vision system that are dedicated to perceiving objects in that location. And you just can't do two different things with that same part of your brain at the same time. It is relatively hard for you to use the same neurons that represent a particular region in space to both simulate a cloud and also perceive a circle and a square. This study shows that the Perky effect is alive and well, not only when people are told explicitly to mentally imagine objects, like in her original work, but also when they simply hear sentences about objects. It also demonstrates that the embodied simulations people activate while listening to language represent objects in their expected locations. Now you might object that this is all fine and good for objects that have a canonical location, but many objects move around. It's not clear, for example, where a donkey usually is, or for that matter a glass, a stone, or a pipe. But when you use these nouns in a sentence with directional verbs like climb and drop, you can infer that they end up in a specific location. That leads us to ask whether a sentence like the glass dropped leads you to mentally simulate the object in the lower part of your imagined visual field. And likewise, Does the donkey climbed cause you to perform mental imagery in the upper part of your visual field? We conducted another experiment to address this question. We again presented participants with spoken sentences, but this time the nouns were neutral for upness and downness, and it was the verbs like drop or climb that indicated a location. We expected that if the verbs in these sentences could cause people to mentally simulate the locations of these objects, even though the objects didn't have canonical locations, we should see the same perky effect. That is, we expected it to take people longer to categorize a circle or a square when it appeared in the same location as the object mentioned in the preceding sentence. And again, this is what we found with an even greater delayed response, about 40 milliseconds slower. When the sentence described an object in the same location as the shape to be categorized. This tells us that when you hear about an object that doesn't have a canonical location, you still perform an embodied simulation of its location, which you construct dynamically by putting together pieces of the sentence. Some of the most exciting evidence about how language leads you to visually simulate comes from eye tracking studies. Eye tracking is a data collection technique that uses high-speed cameras and specialized data analysis software to monitor where exactly a person is looking while performing some task. One of the main benefits of using eye movements as a way to measure what's going on inside people's heads is that despite what you might think, most eye movements are not under conscious control. In fact, our intuitions about how our eyes move are often quite inaccurate. For instance, how do you think your eyes move as you read the words on this page? Many people believe that their eyes move continuously along each line of the text. In fact, though, it was discovered in the 18th century that while reading, our eyes move in leaps or saccades. And they leap a lot. During most of our waking lives, our eyes saccade from one fixation point to the next dozens of times a second, depending on the interesting things around us that we're paying attention to. And not only are these movements not under our conscious control, but they couldn't be. It's just too many movements that are too fine in too little time. As a result, because eye movements is mostly unintentional, and because it is so closely linked to attention, tracking eye movements gives us a pretty good idea of what this visual system is up to. The obvious question that eye tracking can answer with respect to language is whether the visual system is doing similar things when you're understanding spatial language and when you're perceiving actual things in the real world. Cognitive scientist Michael Spivey was the first to address this question using an ingeniously deceptive setup. The issue that Spivey had to overcome is that although natural eye movements are mostly not under conscious control, people are often cautious when they know their eyes are being tracked. So in order to ensure that participants didn't guess the purpose of the experiment or modify their eye movements in conscious ways, he had them take part in a sham experiment in which they had to follow instructions about moving objects around a table while their gaze was being tracked using an eye tracker. Then, during a break in this experiment, participants rotated their chairs so they faced the wide screen. They were told that the eye tracker was being turned off and that they would hear a couple of short stories. Unbeknownst to the participants, this was when the real experiment began. As they heard the stories, their eye movements were in fact recorded. Meanwhile, the stories described scenes that if you were to actually view them, would involve scanning in one direction or another. Compared with a control story, which involved no movement, there were stories that would entail upward, downward, rightward, or leftward eye movement. For instance, contrast the upward and downward stories below.
This kid calls for some coffee.
Upward story. Imagine that you're standing across the street from a 40-story apartment building. At the bottom there is a doorman in blue. On the 10th floor, a woman is hanging her laundry out of the window. On the 29th floor, 2 kids are sitting on the fire escape smoking cigarettes. On the very top floor, 2 people are screaming. Downward story. Imagine you are standing at the top of a canyon. Several people are preparing to rappel down the far canyon wall across you. The first person descends 10 feet before she is brought back to the wall. She jumps again and falls 12 feet. She jumps another 15 feet, and the last jump of 8 feet take her to the canyon floor. Spivey hypothesized that if people listening to these narratives were mentally simulating these scenes as they processed the stories, they should move their eyes in the direction of the described scene. That is, their eyes should make more upward movements while listening to the upward story condition, and more downward movements during the downward story condition. This is precisely what they found. People's eyes jumped significantly more in the direction of the movement in the story than in other directions. The best explanation of these findings is that when processing stories about events taking place in particular locations, understanders construct embodied simulations of objects in those same locations, and their eyes are dragged along for the ride. Subsequent work by a group of researchers in Sweden has extended this finding. Let me check out who they were. Johansson, Holsanova och Holmqvist. Another Johansson. They tracked eye movements while people looked at pictures of objects on a landscape. Then they took the picture away and asked these participants to describe what they had seen while continuing to track their eyes. They also tracked their eye movements while listening to other people's scene descriptions. What they found was that when people heard or talked about specific parts of the picture, their eyes moved to the places on the now blank screen where those objects had originally been. And if that wasn't enough, they even conducted the retelling and listening parts of the experiments in complete darkness, and once again found that they still show the same eye movement patterns. Isn't that just amazing? But what about when objects are described as being in motion? Do we construct dynamic simulations in which we virtually see objects moving through space? This question was first addressed by Daniel Richardson and his colleagues, who conducted a Perky effect experiment, appropriately also at Cornell, much like the ones described above. People listened to sentences that describe either vertical motion, like the strong man lifts the barbell, or horizontal motion, the miner pushes the cart. Then they saw a shape that was either a circle or a square, and had to press the appropriate button as quickly as possible. Just like we saw before, in this experiment though, the shape could appear not only directly above or below the center of the screen, but also immediately right or left of center. The experimenters reasoned that if understanders were constructing mental representations of the entire path of motion, for example from high to low versus left to right, then this should slow down the perception of shapes when they occurred anywhere along the same axis. So the strongman lifts the barbell should produce slower responses to shapes appearing either in the upper or the lower parts of the screen, but faster responses to shapes appearing on the left or right of the screen. Conversely, the miner pushes the cart should produce slower responses to shapes appearing along the same axis, when they're to the right or left of center, but faster responses when they are above or below the center of the screen. This was just what they found. Although this result might suggest that people understanding sentences mentally represent the trajectories of described motion, there could be other explanations. For instance, it could be that hearing a sentence about upward motion causes you to mentally represent a static simulation of the trajectory, something like the motion line you would see in a cartoon to indicate motion. To test whether the visual simulations underlying language understanding are really dynamic, whether you really represent motion in your head, Rolf Zwan and his colleagues introduced a very clever method. They had people listen to sentences that describe the motion of the ball toward or away from the observer. For instance, the pitcher hurled the softball to you versus you hurled the softball to the pitcher. After each sentence, they saw two consequently presented images, each of which was on the screen for half a second. The two pictures were of either the same object, like a softball, or different objects like a softball and a watermelon. The participants had to decide whether the two pictures depicted the same object or not. But the experimenters were not at all interested in the cases where there were two different pictures. The real manipulation dealt only with the matching pictures. what the experimenters did was to slightly modify the size of the second of these pictures so that it was slightly larger or slightly smaller than the first picture. Because the two pictures were shown in quick succession, their difference in size produced an illusion of motion either toward the viewer, if the second picture was larger, or away from the viewer, if it was smaller. The researchers reasoned that if people perform dynamic embodied simulations of motion driven by sentences describing motion toward or away from them, then these simulations should yield faster categorizations of objects that appear to be moving in the same direction. And this is what they found, although small. Only 21 milliseconds on an average. The difference in response times were significant and in the predicted direction. People produced responses more rapidly when the illusory movement of the balls matched the movement described by the sentence in the sentence. Our use of the aware pathway during language understanding ensures that when we think of an elephant, we simulate not only what it looks like, but where it is and where it's going. More broadly, it appears that understanding meaning, at least in part, happens in the mind's eye. Almost like being there. The visual experiences that people have while understanding words. How exactly do they fit together? One can imagine one of several different possibilities. First, it could be that the things were mentally simulated. First, it could be the things that we mentally simulate, nails, stakes, or elephants. We see from a God's eyes view. This is plausible because we know there are neurons in the vision systems that are sensitive to specific objects, but not from any particular viewpoint, but independent on viewpoint. The so-called viewpoint invariant neurons. Maybe these are parts of the vision system we use when understanding language. Maybe the entirety of the nail we see is visible in our mind's eye, not just the side facing us. A second possibility is that perhaps the embodied simulations that we construct actually do adopt a particular viewpoint, but one that is insensitive to the details of the particular sentence. It's well known that people often activate mental representations of objects from so-called canonical perspectives, and perhaps the embodied simulations people activate are basically concatenations of sequences of objects, each viewed from its canonical perspective. Or finally, there's a more radical possibility. What if understanding language were in some way aching to actually being there, to experiencing the events that language describes? In this case, you should again view objects and events from a particular perspective, but one that's dependent on the details of the sentence and its context. This idea is sometimes known as the immersed experiencer view. That is really something. It's blowing me away, this book. What a nice collection of recent research. How can we distinguish among these possibilities? You might think that the immersed experiencer view holds more merit. And if so, you're not alone. This is in fact the view shared, often implicitly, by a number of researchers. But the thing is that all three possibilities, God's eye view, canonical view, and immersed experiencer view, are consistent with basically all the research we reviewed thus far. So whichever one we might think sounds more reasonable, we need a way to distinguish among them empirically. And the way to do this is by looking at differences in the prediction they make about new observations we might be able to collect. The first view to take by the horns is the idea that people adopt a viewpoint invariant God's eye view in the embodied simulations. In principle, this is possible, but there are actually a lot of evidence that word trigger embodied simulations of objects from a specific vantage point. Evidence against viewpoint invariance. Consider the elephant you imagined earlier when told not to. You surely didn't view it from just any arbitrary perspective, like from below, from behind, or above. You almost certainly viewed it either from the side or head-on, or possibly from some intermediate position between the two. In addition to a preferred angle, you probably view the elephant from a preferred distance. Not so close that you could see the individual hairs on its skin, not so far that it would be indistinguishable from a pile of tires. Instead, you probably saw it from a distance where you could just see the whole elephant. Angle and distance make up the perspective from which a real object is viewed, or a described object is simulated. there's a good deal of evidence that people tend to adopt one perspective over the others when conjuring up embodied simulations in response to words. Each work had participants describe the consciously accessible mental images they produce for given words. Unsurprisingly, people reported, like you undoubtedly would, that the mental images tended to take on a particular perspective, which has come in the literature to be called the canonical perspective for an object, like the nail. Just like your mental image of an elephant. But self-reports like these are, as we know, finicky and unreliable. It's preferable not to directly ask people to reflect on what's going on in their own minds. Fortunately, the finding that people prefer to mentally represent objects from certain canonical perspectives has been frequently corroborated by further work using other, more objective measures. It's worth taking a little detour here to talk more about canonical perspectives, because they're actually quite interesting in and of themselves. When we look in a little more detail at the work on canonical perspectives, it's clear that although words for objects like elephant, teacup, and football helmet evoke mental representations in which they are seen from particular perspectives, it's quite hard to figure out why people use the particular canonical perspectives they do for specific objects. The problem is that there are a number of potential factors. You might be more likely to adopt a perspective that's more typical. For instance, you probably interact more frequently with elephants from the side or the front than from below or the back. Another factor is what perspective is more informative. If you imagine a teacup from a certain angles, you might not be able to view the handle or determine what shape it is. So you might prefer to adopt a perspective in which the handle is in view, because this might be the important information about the cup. Although there are debates over exactly what leads people to adopt specific canonical viewpoints and what causes variation between and across individuals, it's implicit in all this work that hearing or reading words for objects drives people to mentally simulate those objects from a particular visual perspective. All of this is evidence against viewpoint invariant, God's eyes mental representations of objects. So that leaves us with two possibilities remaining. We know that when people hear or read words, they mentally simulate the pertinent objects from a given perspective. over the course of understanding a longer, more connected piece of language, like a sentence, paragraph, or even a chapter or a book, do people immerse themselves into the scenes, viewing objects from a perspective such that the way the objects look in their mind's eye are like how they would appear to someone experiencing them firsthand, or are embodied simulation to longer discourse just a smattering of canonical images, popping up one after another. Fortunately, these two views make different, testable predictions. Hooray! Here's one. The immersed experiences view claims that when you're understanding language, you simulate what it would be like to experience the scene that's described. If the immersed experiences view is right, then we should observe that people adopt different perspectives when they process language in which the person experiencing the scene would have a different viewpoint. For instance, this view predicts that you will adopt a different perspective on an elephant when processing a sentence about grabbing an elephant by the tail versus sitting on an elephant's back. And these different perspectives should produce measurable different embodied simulations. By contrast, if people are just activating canonical views of objects, the sentence context shouldn't affect the particular perspectives that people adopt when simulating objects. Italian psychologist Anna Borghi and her colleagues investigated this issue by having people read sentences about objects that implied a perspective that was either internal or external to the object. For instance, you are driving a car implies that you are in the car, but you are washing a car implies that you are outside of it. After they read the sentence, the participants saw an expression identifying an interior part of the car, like steering wheel or gas pedal, or an exterior part of the car, like tires or antenna. And they had to decide as quickly as possible whether the expression described a part of the previous mentioned object, for instance, whether a steering wheel or an antenna was part of the car. The results show that participants responded faster when the perspective suggested by the sentence matched the location of the part. In other words, first reading the sentence, "You are driving a car," made people faster to decide that the steering wheel was part of the car, but slower to decide that tires were part of a car. And vice versa for "You are washing a car." The conclusion: it appears that language does manipulate what perspective you adopt when you mentally simulate objects. This implies more generally that people reading sentences project themselves into mentally simulated experiences of the described scenes. It's just great. Check it out, that camera is still running. There is a second testable implication of the immersed experience of viewing. When you see an event in the real world, you use your visual system, which, with all its limitations, does not always render the scene perfectly. All sorts of factors, rain, fogged up glasses, blurred vision, can obscure and decrease the visibility of otherwise observable things. If we really do immerse ourselves in a virtual simulation of experience a described event, then we should represent the described objects as measurable, more or less visible. And how visible an object is should depend on how visible it should be to someone experience the actual scene. Researchers at Florida State has tested this prediction in a clever way. They presented participants with sentences about people viewing objects through an occlusive or transparent medium. For instance, contrast: through the clean goggles, the skier could easily identify the moose, through the fog goggles, the skier could hardly identify the moose. Participants then saw a picture of an object, and in the critical trials, it was the object mentioned in the preceding sentence. They had to decide whether that object had been mentioned in the sentence. I don't believe this. The trick was that the moose could be depicted in high or low resolution. The experimenters found that, surprisingly, people were faster to identifying the matching picture. High resolution pictures after sentences about clear vision, and low resolution pictures after sentences about obscured vision. This is compelling evidence that people are simulating what it would be like to be there in the scene, because from any viewpoint than inside the skier's goggles. The moose wouldn't be hard to see when the goggles were fogged up. And yet people act like they were having more trouble seeing the moose when simply hearing about someone else having trouble seeing the moose. Other experimental evidence pointing in the same directions comes from another recent study in which people read stories that, similarly to the high and low visibility sentences, described a person whose view of a number of objects was either clear or obscured. After the story was over, they were asked to say were there objects that had been mentioned in the story, and they were significantly faster to do so when the object had been described as clearly visible than when they had been described as obscured, as with the fogged up goggles. Again, it seems that when we hear or read about objects, we mentally simulate them from the perspective of someone actually experiencing the scene. Not from a God's eye view and not from a canonical viewpoint. There's even some recent work showing that people mentally simulate an object differently according to the distance a sentence suggests they would be from it. This is a work that a graduate student, Bodo Winter, did with me. Perspective involves not just the angle that you see an object from and its ease of visibility, but also its distance away from you. Compared with objects viewed from close up, far away objects look smaller, blurrier. So if the immersed experiencer's view is correct, then when a sentence indicates that an object will be seen from far away, farther away, you should see it in your mind's eye as smaller and blurrier than when it's described as close by. We tested this in much the same way as several of the previously discussed studies. People read sentences like the ones in figure 14, which suggest that the object was relatively close or relatively far from the observer. Then people saw an image that either depicted the object just mentioned or not. We were only interested in the cases where the object had indeed been mentioned, in which we presented either a large and clear image of the object or a small and blurry one. Like previous work, we found that people were faster to verify the object in the matching conditions than the mismatching ones. Responses were about 50 milliseconds faster to a small image after a sentence about the object being far away, and about 50 milliseconds faster, this is amazing, to a large image after the sentence about the object being close. So when you understand language about objects that are implied to be closer or farther, you represent those objects as having visual characteristics appropriate to their distance. Rolf Zwan put it eloquently when he first described the immersed experiencer idea. Comprehension is the vicarious experience of the described events through the integration and sequences of traces from an actual experience cued by the linguistic input. As it turns out, people don't just visually simulate from a given perspective. The next chapter reveals what things look like in your mind's eye is only the beginning of the story. And now we're getting over to chapter 4. That was chapter 3 we just ended. And now we move on to chapter 4. Chapter 4, Over the Top. If you're like me, your victories in arm wrestling are few and far between, except against the young, the infirm, or the unconscious. This is at least in part because when most people have normal human-sized forearm, I have popsicle sticks. But if you're like me, and if this failing causes you mental anguish, fear not. It turns out that being built like Popeye is not the only way to get the upper hand, as it were in arm wrestling. No, like in other sports, technique is nearly as important as physique. Case in point, consider the compelling argument for technique by Sylvester Stallone in Over the Top. Undisputedly the greatest arm wrestling film in the history of world cinema. In the film, Stallone plays a truck driver named Lincoln Hawk, who enters an arm wrestling competition with the noble objective of winning back the respect of the son he abandoned. Hawk's road to victory is predictably long and full of apparently unsurmountable setbacks, but he succeeds because he has a secret weapon, the top roll technique. If you find yourself needing to make amends with an estranged offspring through arm wrestling, here's how you can do it using moves like slide. First, scoot your elbow forward toward your opponent. This makes your forearm stand more upright, and as a result, your hand will be higher than your opponent's, giving you a leverage advantage. Then, as you grip your opponent's hand, grab it higher than you normally would. Instead of hooking your thumb around the base of theirs, slide your hand up a little so you're grasping farther up toward the tip of the thumb. When you start the actual wrestling, curl your wrist towards you, using the leverage that you have over your opponent's hand, which will flex your opponent's hand backward and give you an additional leverage advantage. From there, you should be able to chop an even stronger opponent's hand toward your side. And of course, if life imitates art, by doing so, you will also topple any barriers between you and your estranged children. So that's a little insight on arm wrestling technique. But let's pause for a moment to reflect on what you've just done. You read a couple of hundred words, and from those words you have created new knowledge that you could put into action if you wanted it. If you take a step back, this is pretty amazing. No other species has anything like the capacity that you have to look at lines and curves and dots on a page, interpret them as describing actions you never performed or possibly even seen before, and translate them into plans for action that you can execute using your arms. Perhaps this doesn't seem like such a remarkable capacity to you. After all, you do it all the time, when you read about how to contort your body in a new yoga pose, the upside down lotus, or when a company memo reminds you about the best way to lift boxes of books without straining your back. But one way to achieve the appropriate sense of wonder is to ask yourself, if you had to engineer a biological system that could do what you can do, translate words into actions, how would you do it? It's an important question because in fact a lot of what we say and write has to do with people moving around in the world. Sometimes it's a form of instructions, when to press down on the clutch and how quickly to release the gas, that you should stop scratching that scab or it will scar, or how far you have to roll up your sleeve to keep them clean while you're hollowing out a jack-o'-lantern. People also give descriptions of things they have done or witnessed, how they tripped over a skateboard in a garage, or how in this game against the Lakers, Dr. J reached for completely out of bounds under the basket to scoop in the layup. How do we take words and sentences that we hear or read and convert them into thoughts about actions that we might never have performed or seen? And more interestingly, into instructions for how we might perform those same actions with our own bodies. Any description of action by necessity leaves out lots of details. How do we make inferences about how our bodies would move were we to perform those actions? For instance, in reading the top roll description, you might have inferred that when you push your elbow toward your opponent, you nevertheless keep it down on the table, and that when you do this, you need to lean a bit, because otherwise your arm will be too far from your body to generate much power. Or you might have inferred that as you rule your hand over your opponents, you twist your hand so that your palm faces down. How do you know all this even though it was never mentioned? The short story, as I'm sure you will have no difficulty guessing by this point, is that people understand language about physical actions by performing motor simulations of the described actions, using the brain systems responsible for coordinating and executing actual action. But first, we need to know a little more about how the brain represents action. And for that, we turn to monkeys. Monkeys do, monkeys see. In the 1980s and the 1990s, neuroscientists at the University of Parma in Italy was studying exactly how neurons in the brains of macaque monkeys control their body movements. To do this, they inserted electrodes into the monkeys' brains, targeting individual neurons in motor regions, and measured the electrical activity that each neuron produced when the monkey performed different actions. The first thing they found was fascinating, but in retrospect, not particularly surprising. The monkey brain contains within it neurons that only fire to control particular actions. So there are neurons that selectively drive what's called a precision grasp, pressing the thumb against the fingertips as you might pick up a paperclip, and different neurons that fire for a power grasp, the way you might grasp the handle of a hammer. I say that this should be unsurprising simply because we know that monkeys are able to select from an array of different actions. And because the motor system is in control of this action, it must have distinct ways of represent each one. The more remarkable and unexpected finding, one that some neuroscientists have called the most important in decades, was that some of those very same neurons dedicated to specific actions on specific objects became active not just when the monkey was performing an action, but also when it was observing someone else perform the same action. In other words, if one of the scientists were to pick up a paperclip, the paperclip grasping neurons in the part of the monkey's brain that controls action would start to get excited, but the hammer grabbing neurons would not, and vice versa. If the monkey saw the experimenter pick up a hammer, along the top of the conditions, an experimenter picking up a piece of food, the monkey picking up a piece of food, or to make sure the neurons aren't just responding to someone's interacting with the food, an experimenter grasping the food with pliers. Further down, there is a representation of each time the neuron in question became excited enough to fire. The x-axis is time, so you can see from the beginning of the action when the neuron fired. And at the very bottom is a histogram that summarizes the firing of this same neuron of the repeated trials depicted above. You can see that this particular mirror neuron fires most concentratedly when the monkey is grasping the food, to a lesser but still substantial degree when the experimenter grasps it, and almost not at all when the experimenter uses pliers on the food. The discovery of these mirror neurons, so called because they seem to encode both the performance and observation of specific actions, is compelling for several reasons. Foremost among these is that these mirror brain structures offer an exciting potential explanation for how it's possible for our macaque cousin and for us to recognize, predict, and understand the physical actions of others. If recognizing another's actions involves activating some of the same brain structures that we use to perform the same actions. Then we can use all the neural machinery we have that's dedicated to action. Machinery for predicting outcomes of actions, for calculating the goals of actions, etc. To reason and make inferences about the actions we see, just as we would about actions we're enacting ourselves. Most cognitive neuroscientists now believe that the same sort of representational architecture is at play in humans. But recording from individual neurons is a stickier enterprise in humans than in monkeys, because we have to actually open up a hole in the skull to insert the electrode, and the institutional boards that regulate research with human subjects tend not to look so favorable on this practice. So we can't just take single cell recordings of mirror neurons in the human brain. However, in humans, we can look at populations of neurons through brain imaging. And indeed, brain imaging research shows overlap in brain activation while people perform and perceive specific actions. That is, although there isn't direct evidence of individual mirror neurons in humans, there is evidence of mirror neurons that appear to behave as one would expect if indeed human motor control systems doubled as a motor action perception systems. Mirror neurons and the mirror systems they are part of are relevant to the question of language in the following way. Perceiving someone else perform an action results in the activation of your own motor system. What if understanding language about action hooks into this same system, such that the motor system can be used not only when people are acting, perceiving action, and thinking about action, but also when they are understanding language about acting? This is page 78. Put a stop there before the camera of the mobile stops me. It's incredibly interesting. I'm just gobsmacked. Here in this book is a concentrated way all that's been revealed the last 20 years since the beginning of this now progressively faster development. It's wildly interesting. It's wildly interesting. There are other books that are even more recent and can take in more into regard. And I think this is a good start because it's a lot to take in. Yes, the languages in the book is fairly simple, but the ideas, no, not at all. It's not so hard to understand that this development, this incredible exploration had to wait. It is mind-boggling. It is mind-defying. It defies everything we know about reality. And as I mentioned in the last summary, it's no wonder most scientists, philosophers, thinkers have not caught up with this. I have problem striving with this as well. It is just blows your mind. Well, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning. Bye-bye for now.